Welcome to Truth to Power. This is Hart Hagen, and I'm here with James Miller. James is a teacher at DuPont Manual. James, how about if you tell us a little bit about yourself, and then we'll talk about the topic for today, which is manufacturing consent. But tell us about James Miller.
Sure. I currently teach journalism at DuPont Manual High School. I spent some time working for local media. At one point, I worked for the Courier Journal and for WHS 11 in very minor jobs. But of course, as is true with all of us, I've been a consumer of the news media for most of my adult life. And of course, a careful reader of Chomsky and other media critics.
Yeah. So tell me how you ran across Chomsky and what has that meant in your life? And we'll get to more conversation. I sound like I'm interviewing. You're not going to be on the hot seat the whole time, but.
I want to say I first read Chomsky in college. I think there was an organization that was putting out pamphlets that were shorter versions of longer essays and arguments by a lot of intellectuals around at the time, which would be the late 80s and early 90s. So, Chomsky, Angela Davis, Howard Zinn. I think I first encountered Chomsky in this pamphlet series. And from there, I started to read his books and listen to his lectures and things like that.
Yeah. So let's talk to the audience a little bit about what manufacturing consent is. So here's how I would say it. Here's how you have to get used to the idea that the news media is not a charity and it's not a public service. The news media is a business. They have an agenda. Their agenda is not to tell you the truth. Their agenda is to have a successful business that earns profits, and the more the better. Am I on the right track with that?
Yeah, and to that, I would add that there's a lot that the media, in particular the news media, does that has nothing to do with whether or not they're profitable. I'm sure there's lots of public services that they do. There's lots of charity work that they do, but all of that is aside from profit. So I think the question is not so much is what we're doing making us profits, but is what we're doing going to hurt our profits? Mm-hmm. And once you think of it that way, then you can understand a lot more of the press's decisions.
Well, let's talk about some of the things that, let's talk for a minute about the five filters, and then we'll maybe get into some specific topics. So Noam Chomsky says that, do we want to talk a little bit about who Noam Chomsky is? So I would say, Noam Chomsky is a retired emeritus professor from MIT, professor of linguistics. He's huge in the field of linguistics. He's like the Einstein of linguistics. He has completely transformed the field. He's currently 92 years old. He was born going on 92. He was born in 1928 on Pearl Harbor Day, which before it was Pearl Harbor Day, but December 7th. And by the time you get to the mid 50s or so, he's really, he's a professor and making a name for himself. But in addition to, and apparently quite separate from his linguistics career, he is a famous political dissident. He's always, from the establishment's viewpoint, I think he's always on the wrong side of things. He's written over 100 books, one of which is Manufacturing Consent, which he wrote with Edward Herman. Edward Herman was at the Wharton School of Business. And so the idea behind manufacturing consent is that the media is not, the media, they end up serving powerful interests. I mean, they're reporting and their biases are determined by the interests that they serve. Am I on the right track with that?
Yeah, and one of the things that Chomsky and Herman both try to make clear in their book, Manufacturing Consent, and in the way they spoke about it since the book had been published, is that this is not a conspiracy theory. There's not, the smoky back room with a bunch of, television network and cable news network executives smoking cigars and plotting on how to, marginalize Bernie Sanders or how to make fun of the Green New Deal or anything like that. The metaphor that I like to use when I'm talking about this with my students is to think about it in terms of any other business. You know, if I am working at Starbucks and I consistently tell people who come to Starbucks, hey, you know what, coffee's not good for you, or you know what, you probably shouldn't buy that cake pop because you know it's got a lot of calories, or hey, maybe you should think about going to Heine Brothers, or maybe you know, right? So
Right.
if I say those things as an employee of Starbucks, Starbucks is probably not going to let me be their employee very
Right.
longer. And it's not a conspiracy. There's not like a memo written at the head executive at Starbucks that says fire anybody who talks about the calorie content of cake pops.
Mm-hmm.
That is just an attitude that all businesses have, which is that we're here to support the product. We're here to make money. And just about every journalist you talk to, if you ask them about Chomsky and Herman's theory, is going to just straight up tell you, well, no one tells me what to report. No one tells me what to do. And you can find many examples of journalists doing reports that in fact do upset some advertisers. I remember there was a story that one of the local TV stations did about this car dealership called JD Byrider. And they exposed some, if I remember correctly, some shady, underhanded financial practices of JD Byrider, who was just advertiser for the station. And you know, they told the station, hey, if you run the story, we're pulling all our advertising. And the station said, go right ahead. But I think that, first of all, that's an exception and not the rule.
Right. Exception. Right.
Right. Second of all, you can see that very easily in local outfits where, you know, who aren't struggling financially, such as the TV stations. It is less likely to see that at a news outlet that is struggling for either credibility or financial success.
Right.
And then third, you know, you can see it much bigger on a national scale. I think, you know, the example that I like to refer to is MSNBC and Phil Donahue at the beginning of the second invasion of Iraq, the second Iraq war in 2003. Phil Donahue is asking all these questions about whether or not we should go to Iraq, whether or not the invasion was a good idea, whether or not the invasion would make things worse. And MSNBC, the liberal network,
Mm-hmm.
fired Phil Donahue
Mm-hmm.
because they were afraid of the backlash. You would think that the network that everybody associated with liberals and Democrats would be, you know, would uplift this anti-war voice, because I think that's part of what it means to be, you know, at least a leftist or a progressive or a liberal, is to be skeptical about saber rattling and warfare. But no, MSNBC thought this is going to be bad for business. They got rid of Phil Donahue. We had a more recent example of this where Bloomberg News killed an investigation by one of its reporters of the Chinese government and the Chinese government's relationship with a lot of wealthy Chinese executives. And the reason that Bloomberg News killed this investigation is because they were explicitly worried about blowback from the Chinese government. They're worried that they would get kicked out of China. They couldn't do any more reporting on the Chinese economy. They would lose special access. You know, this is almost like all five of the filters, which we'll talk about later, happening at once, right? Mm-hmm. And if folks want to see that story, that was published on April 14th of this year, 2020, by David Folkenflik of NPR. The story's called Bloomberg News Killed Investigation, Fired Reporter, Then Sought to Silence His Wife. And if that's not the most clear current example of Chomsky and Herman's 5 filters in manufacturing consent, I don't know what is.
So how does that illustrate some of those principles?
So Chomsky and Herman said that in their research, they discovered that the media passed information through what they called 5 filters of information. This first filter is ownership. Who owns the media? Obviously, the people who own the media and who own the companies that own the media are not going to sit around and let journalists make media owners look bad. You know, when Sheldon Adelson bought that Las Vegas newspaper, I'm sure that the journalists there are not going out of their way to investigate Sheldon Adelson's casinos. And it's not, Sheldon Adelson doesn't even have to send out a memo
that
says, leave me and my casinos alone. Just like, you know, people who work at Starbucks know better than to sit around and badmouth the manager, badmouth the owner, badmouth the idea of coffee, and so on and so forth, right? You don't do that at a business. No matter where you're the employee, you don't sit around and badmouth the boss. And it doesn't matter if you're a public school teacher, or you are a barista at a coffee shop, or if you are an executive at a hotel chain, you know that part of job security is not bad mouthing, criticizing, or embarrassing the boss. So that's what that first filter is about. The ownership filter basically argues that journalists who have the opportunity to report a story that will cast a bad light on the owners or the owner's interests are likely to not report that story. They're likely to self-censor, because for the reason that all employees sort of self-censor their criticisms of the boss when the boss is around and listening.
So you're saying that they don't have to be told directly. They know instinctively that if I'm going to attend to my career, if I'm going to move up in this organization, maybe even they self-censor when they're thinking about who their next employer might be.
Right, exactly. And, you know, people who are applying for jobs in the journalism world, just like the rest of us, rely upon their reputation. And if they get a reputation for butting heads with the boss, for pushing things too far, for asking too many questions of the wrong people, then, you know, they may get employed at some modest, you know, online far left wing or far right wing operation, but, you know, they're not going to get a job at a big corporate news organization, because the first rule of every corporation, whether it's news or not, is do what the boss tells you. Don't embarrass the boss. Don't upset the boss. Don't hurt the company's bottom line.
So what are the other filters? We've talked a little bit about ownership. Have we talked about sponsorship yet?
Well, that leads right into sponsorship, where we talk about don't mess with the company's bottom line. One of the insights that Chomsky and Herman had is that we, the people, the audience, the viewers, the readers, are not the true customers of the news media.
Yes.
And you can tell who the true customer is by how money changes hands, right? Mm-hmm. If you are observing a store and somebody walks in with a handful of money and hands it to somebody behind the counter, and the person behind the counter hands them a product, and the person takes the product and walks out, you think, oh, okay, the guy who came in and handed over the money, that was the customer, right? The guy standing outside waiting for a bus is not the customer. The guy in back picking up trash is not the customer. The guy next door at the hardware store is not the customer. The guy who walks in with the money and exchanges it for goods or services, that's the customer. So much of the media in our lives is either extremely cheap to the point where it's not covering all their costs, mm-hmm. or it's free.
Right.
Who's the customer then? The customer is the advertiser. And just as any business is not going to do things that are going to upset their advertisers, the same is also true of for-profit journalism and communication organizations. Does that make sense?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. So if I'm a reporter, I'm working for the New York Times, and I know that this or that organization, this or that company is pulling out full-page ads in the New York Times. You know, there was a I can't bring that example to mind, but it just seems like recently, maybe on the Jimmy Dore show, there was somebody who was saying, I don't even know who the advertisers are. It was kind of hard to believe. It's like, anyway.
Right.
So we talk.
But again, you know, it doesn't have to be the reporter, but particular reporter. It could be another reporter sitting at the desk next to you. You know, it could be, you know, somebody else who works there. And the thing about these media companies, the big media companies, is that no reporter puts their story directly to the people. It has to pass up through a chain of proofreaders, copy readers, fact checkers, editors, and so on and so forth. So the reporter may not know who the advertisers are. The reporter may be defiant. The reporter may say, well, I don't care what the bosses say. I'm still going to do this. But this is exactly what happened with this piece about China's oligarchs that Bloomberg News killed. The reporter was defiant. The reporter had actually previously published a story about these wealthy networks in China that upset Chinese authorities, and then was about to publish a follow-up that was even more indicting, more damning, and Bloomberg killed it, specifically because they're worried about the backlash from these authorities. So, which brings us to the next filter, which is access.
Okay. Let's talk
So,
about access. So if I'm a reporter,
mhm.
go ahead, talk about access.
So probably the biggest example of access journalism that we can all see on a regular basis is local television news and the police.
Hmm.
Um, Local TV news especially treats the police department not only as a government agency on which they should keep an eye as watchdogs, right? Not only as a potential source, but you see a lot of local news organizations, local TV news organizations who treat the police as an ally or as colleagues, brothers in arms or whatever. And it is because they rely very heavily on the police for access. Every year, my students spend an entire month watching local television news. And every year
Wow.
they document the type of news that we hear and see on local TV news. And every year, the number one story category on all the stations is crime.
Mhm.
And the reason that it's so popular is because number one, we, the public, like to watch those stories. There's no denying that. But number two, those stories are easy to do. All you have to do is sit and listen to the police scanner. You hear a 911 call come in. You rush out there with the SAT truck. There's a police spokesperson who's already there.
Mm.
You shoot some B-roll of the caution tape flapping in the wind. You shoot some B-roll of the red and blue lights. You shoot some B-roll of the neighbors standing around. And then you get an interview from the police department spokesperson. Bam, there's your top story for the 5 o'clock news. They really rely on the police department for access. And so one of the things they don't want to do is upset this important source for stories, which are a really big part of what they do.
Mhm.
You also see this with the White House press pool.
Mhm.
We see a little bit more pushback from them nowadays,
Mhm.
but the White House press pool, I think, is notoriously spineless
Mm.
because what they don't want to do is lose their access, right? Like getting into the White House press corps is a very prestigious appointment. You know, it's a very top tier job in DC, and they don't want to lose that access. And so, you know, they're still playing this game with the, you know, the Trump administration, where they figure if they ask enough polite, pointed questions, they'll finally get him to admit that something that he's saying is just made up on the spot or contradictory to what he said before that. But that's not how Trump works.
Mhm.
The point is that they're there to protect their access.
Mhm.
Journalists heavily rely on sources, both named sources and unnamed sources. They rely on sources in local government, which includes the police, and they're not going to have the same types of stories without those sources.
Right.
And so they absolutely need that access to that information in order to produce their product, which means they need to maintain a good relationship with those sources.
Yeah. Another example is like the Pentagon just puts countless billions of dollars into serving up the news and information to the press. And that to me is a form, it's not only a form of access, but it's almost a form of sponsorship. But
Oh, sure, absolutely. We also see this with political campaigns. You know, every 2 years, every 4 years, local TV stations get floods of money. They just get so much
mm,
money from people running for office. And that is a major source of income for local TV stations and, of course, local radio stations, too. And so Chomsky and Herman would predict, I think accurately, that local TV and radio stations are not going to spend a lot of time investigating or challenging the massive flow of private or dark money in local politics because it is a huge cash cow for them.
mhm.
That represents both the ownership filter, the sponsorship filter, and the access or sourcing filter.
Okay, so we've got 5 filters. Let's talk about number 4, which is FLAC. What is that?
So a lot of journalists take, I think, at least a little bit of pride in getting angry feedback, right? They do a story where they expose the senator's corruption, and then the senator and his supporters get mad,
Mhm.
and the reporter pats themselves on the back, right? Like, ha, like I made all the right people mad.
Mhm.
So flack is not just negative feedback. I think a lot of reporters, you know, the longer you're in journalism, the more used you are to getting negative feedback. Like every reporter that I follow on Twitter at least once has mentioned, the latest hate mail or has taken a screenshot of some nasty tweet that was sent to them. That's not what Flack is. That's just everyday, negative feedback. Flack is a concerted effort, not just by your audience, but by your peers, by your superiors in the news business, by potential employers to go after your reporting. I think the best example of this was a gentleman who worked for, I think it was the Sacramento Bee, who wrote an expose on the CIA's relationship to drug trafficking in Central South America and the United States. The story was called...
Maybe San Jose. I'm being a know-it-all, but it seems like it was San Jose or Santa Fe or something. Well, anyway, but go ahead.
Maybe right. It may have been the San Jose Daily paper.
Okay.
But the story was called Dark Alliance. It was written by this reporter, Gary Webb, who up until this point was a pretty much unassailable reporter, right? This guy's not some conspiracy theorist. He was not some like far left or far right whack job who would just print anything. This guy had chops. This guy knew what he was doing. So he reported this deeply researched story called Dark Alliance. And the CIA, which we know has relationships with a lot of the major press outlets, such as Time Magazine, the New York Times, the Washington Post, so on and so forth, pushed back on this. And you saw every major press outlet in the United States provide incredibly counter-reporting to Gary Webb's story. And this is probably the most egregious example of Flack that I can think of. But you see it in other cases too. You see it when
let's give a little bit more detail about that. So this was this was like the CIA straight up running guns or drugs. Which one was it?
Well, the most charitable version of the story is that the CIA looked the other, like they knew that drug cartels.
Oh, the Contras, the Nicaragua Contras were making money from the cocaine trade.
Right. Okay. And the most charitable possible interpretation of this story, like even if you believe all the criticism and blowback from the government and from the mainstream news organizations, the most charitable interpretation is still that the CIA knew that the Contras were flooding LA with cocaine to fund their rebellion and did nothing.
Yeah.
Right. It was the San Jose Mercury News. That was the name of the newspaper.
Okay, great.
So that was the story. It was a Dark Alliance.
And that's a big story because we have this war on drugs, this pretentious, self-righteous war on drugs.
Right.
For one thing. For another thing, the CIA is supposed to be protecting us, and the Contras are supposed to be freedom fighters. So we learn that the CIA knows that the Contras are running drugs, looks the other way. Big story. So why is that not a big story by all accounts?
I think that a lot of news reporters operate under the assumption that their country, and this is not just true of American news reporters, I think this is true of news reporters around the world, right? They want to think that their country is always acting in the public's best interests. They want to have the most charitable interpretation of actions that the government carries out in their name. They don't want to believe the worst. Now, of course, there have been examples of journalists discovering and reporting the absolute worst, but usually those come in the cases of they either come out as a very long, slow dribble. You know, we think of Watergate as like one story that sort of like toppled the Nixon administration, but it wasn't. It was a whole bunch of stories that trickled out over a very long period of time that gradually sort of acclimated the public to the idea that this stuff was going on in the Nixon administration. Plus, it is also true that the Washington Post and DC journalists in general already were not fond of Nixon. Nixon had an adversarial relationship with the press. But I guarantee you that the press, if they had discovered something similar happening under a candidate that the press was more fond of, then you might have seen more of this flack, more of this sort of like institutional skepticism. We see the same thing right now with Trump. I think the right-wing critics are right. The press does not like Trump, but it's not because of his policies, because his policies are in fact very mainstream Republican policies.
Oh yeah.
It's because he is gauche. It is because he does not play the DC cocktail party game. But they approach him with the same type of skepticism that they should have approached every presidential candidate, every president, every high-level government official with. They reserved all this vitriol for Trump because he's an outsider, he's a gross guy, they don't like him personally, so on and so forth. They could have reported on every president going back to Nixon or even before Nixon with the same level of skepticism and vitriol, and that would have been a service to the country, I think.
Mm-hmm. Right. So we've talked about we're going through the five filters of Chomsky's model of manufacturing consent. Let me just orient our audience. If you're just joining us, this is Hart Hagen and James Miller. We're on the WFMP 106.5 FM, and we're talking about manufacturing consent, which is Noam Chomsky's and Edward Herman's theory about how the media really works. The subtitle of the book is The Political Economy of the Mass Media. And we're talking about, how the mass media really works. We're talking about the five filters that determine what information gets through to us and what doesn't. The first three filters are ownership, sponsorship, and access. And we also talked about flack. So the fifth filter is, what's the fifth filter, James?
Well, when Chomsky and Herman wrote this book, they called the fifth filter anti-communism. And the idea was that, journalists who criticized the administration or who sort of went outside the Overton window on policies were accused of being communist sympathizers or actual communists. Obviously, like, this was really big, in the 1950s during the Red Scare, but this same sort of thing continued into the 1980s with Reagan up through the fall of the Soviet Union. And then once the Soviet Union went away, this final filter of anti-communism didn't make much sense. So the way that I teach to my students now is this fifth filter is about a national enemy. And currently, I would say that national enemy is probably terrorism at this point.
Right.
Who knows what it'll be in 20 years or 30 years or 100 years. But right now, ever since, 2001, the national enemy is terrorism. And, what you saw was when journalists would criticize the excesses of the so-called war on terror, they would get hit with, opinion articles, comments, and feedback or flack from people that basically said, you're on the side of the terrorists.
Right.
Bush himself, the president set this up, this sort of false dichotomy up at the very beginning, when he said you're either with us or you're with the terrorists. And so if you're criticizing the efforts of the war on terror, you're pro-terrorist. If you're criticizing the war on drugs, then you must use drugs. If you criticize, the Sandinistas or the Contras or, the U.S. like funding the Mujahideen in Afghanistan in the 80s, well, then you must be, pro-communist, right? That's how that works.
Right. So let's talk about some, I'm going to share my screen with you. Let's talk about some specifics of specific examples. So we've been talking about manufacturing consent. Let's look at how does, for one thing, how does the media, let's talk about war for a minute. How does the media manufacture consent? Who wins when the media manufactures consent around war? And, how does that work?
Well, again, I want to stress that the manufacture of consent is not a deliberate, conscious process. There's not a meeting at ABC or Fox or CNN headquarters where they say, we are going to censor all voices for peace, right? It's just that they're making sets of assumptions about what their audience wants. They're making sets of assumptions about what their sources want. They're making sets of assumptions about what their advertisers want. And plus, they're just sort of like limited to what their own experiences and knowledge are. You know, it's like if you ask somebody what's for dinner and that person is not a vegan, they're not going to suggest any vegan dishes, right? That's outside of their experience. Or if you're going to ask somebody what's for dinner and, you know, they don't have a, you know, serious allergy to cheese, then of course, one of the things they might suggest might have cheese in it. Likewise, when people who are high up in the political and media establishment talk about war, it does not occur to them that, you know what, maybe we don't have to go to war. Maybe we could have peace. Mm-hmm. So the debate is never over war versus peace. The debate is always over something like, should we go to war by ourselves or should we go to war with our allies? Right. Should we use, you know, should we carpet bomb, you know, civilian targets, or should we use targeted bombs on military targets? Should we have sanctions first, and then if they don't give up after 6 months, then bomb them? Or should we bypass the sanctions and start bombing immediately? Those are the debates that we always have about war in the press. And so this is how manufacturing consent comes about when it comes to issues of war, is sort of like the limiting and the narrowing of options that are on the table for discussion. Just look at, like, even the liberal network, MSNBC, when they have a panel discussion about military issues, the people sitting around the panel are all either ex-military officials or they are pundits who have a long record of being pro-war. And that's their liberal, you know, area. That's their liberal choice. That's their liberal panel, is generals and pundits who have in the past advocated for war. There's no voices for peace at the table.
Right. So if we want to know about why the media is so into war, one thing to look at is who sponsors the media. I mean, Bechtel, Boeing, General Dynamics, these are all war contractors. Am I on the right track with that?
Well, I would say that even if the war contractors all stopped advertising with the press, there's still sort of the force of habit, you know, the sort of like realm of discussion that they're used to. You know, it's the same reason that when they talk about, I don't know, when they talk about what to do about public education, the answer always takes place within a certain context, you know, a certain Overton window of discussion. Of course, the right wing has moved that Overton window to include things like privatization, charter schools, and so on and so forth. The window does not include things like unschooling or homeschooling yet, right? It's not that those options don't exist. It's not that they're not valid options. It's just that those options are not familiar to the experience of these folks who are organizing debates and coverage about these topics in the press, right? It's the same thing with war. Even if you get rid of all the war advertisers, there's still going to be a very sort of limited area of discussion.
Why?
For the reasons I explained, because of, you know, these folks like cultural backgrounds. I forget who said it, but there's a very famous quote. It may be by Orwell or Twain, who said, "It is hard to get a man to understand something when his salary depends on him not understanding it."
Upton Sinclair.
And so, Upton Sinclair, one of those guys. Yeah, there you go. And so, like, if you have somebody who is planning guests for Meet the Press.
So what I'm saying is, where does that salary come from? The salary comes from the revenues of the business. The revenues of the business come from their advertisers. You know, war manufacturers, war contractors have a long history of not only sponsoring the media, but also taking out full page ads to advocate for this or that. So.
Oh, absolutely.
And why was Phil Donahue fired? So why was Phil Donahue fired?
Okay, so Phil Donahue was fired from MSNBC. I think you could certainly make an argument that war profiteers would have been unhappy with his continued advocacy. But I think what was an even bigger concern to MSNBC was that they were worried about the flack, about the public pressure, not just from the viewers, but from politicians and other networks who would rake at MSNBC over the coals, plus other advertisers who may not be connected to warfare at all, don't want to be the target of boycott campaigns. They don't want to be the target of people who say, oh, look at Home Depot, they're advertising on the anti-war, pro-terrorist MSNBC. Let's boycott them, right?
Right.
People want to back away from these unpopular messages, or what they think of as unpopular messages, right? And so I think that's another way that we manufacture consent with war. It's not just we're afraid of upsetting actual war profiteers such as Boeing. It is that we're also afraid of upsetting our other audience. We're afraid of upsetting our peers in the business. We're afraid of upsetting our sources.
Let me share something with you. You probably have a much deeper understanding of this than I do. My eyes start to glaze over when you seem to kind of talk about. I feel like you're making it more complicated than it is. I know it's systemic. I know that it's probably more complicated than I imagine it is, but let's take pharmaceuticals. So pharmaceuticals, prescription drugs back in the early 2000s, maybe late 90s, all of a sudden got the right to advertise on TV. And the story became, all these disgusting side effects that they have to talk about. And at the time, it's like, prescription drugs get to advertise on TV. But what I didn't realize until recently is that when pharmaceutical companies get to advertise on TV, then they get to pour money into TV, so that if they're doing stupid stuff that causes us to have to pay 10 times more for a drug, then the media is just not going to go there.
Oh yeah, I mean, to go back to the very beginning of the 5 filters, we have ownership and advertising, right? So yeah, there's no doubt about it. In a capitalist society, the place where you get your money is always going to be of a concern to you. Go back to the example about Starbucks. You're not going to piss off the guy that signs your check when you're the barista at Starbucks. This is why, for example, employees are reluctant to speak out about things like sexual abuse and harassment, why they're reluctant to talk about union organizing, why they're reluctant to speak up about injustice. They don't want to get fired.
Right.
Likewise, I think that, at some level in these media institutions, that there is some pressure to not piss off the advertisers. I think that's absolutely true. I just think it's more complicated than that. I think it's like, even if you have 1 or 2 advertisers that pull out, there's still going to be sort of like this institutional pressure to not upset everybody else.
Mm-hmm. So,
and then why bother? Because there's so many easy targets for the press to report on. Look at the local news. They, roll up the shady parts of town and say, look at these people out here smoking weed publicly. Who cares? They're not hurting anybody. But that's treated as like this big story, like tonight's I-Team investigation. Like, look at these poor people enjoying themselves. Why can they do that type of story? It's because poor people don't have lobbyists. Poor people don't buy advertising. Poor people don't play golf with the station's owner, right? They're not going to go to, all the check cashing places that are all owned by one rich guy who plays golf with the TV station's owner and do a story on his exploitation of poor people. That's going to ruffle feathers. Doing stories about, like, look at these poor people arrested for committing crimes, that's not going to ruffle anybody's feathers. And the people whose feathers do get ruffled are people who cannot afford to express their displeasure with the station in a way that is meaningful to the station.
How would you like for our media to be different? I mean, what's possible in a perfect world? In James Miller's perfect world, you can wave a magic wand and make something happen. What would you like to change about the media to make it more, more serve the public interest rather than private interests?
Well, I think right now, a lot of folks in the media, when they do things where they think of themselves as serving the public, they're in fact serving only a portion of the public. They're serving the tax-paying, home-owning, country club going, job creators, commuting to work, like this section of the public, because that's who their advertisers are trying to reach. And every TV station, every media outlet, as a matter of fact, if you call them up and say, I want to buy an ad who watches your station, who reads your paper, who looks at your website, who listens to your radio show. They have that data, and they can give you a sheet. In fact, even a nonprofit like Louisville Public Media collects data on who listens to their stations, because they use that to convince sponsors, like, look at these highly educated, smart, savvy people who listen to WFPL and WFPK. Don't you want them to hear your sponsorship? This is true for all media outlets. So in my perfect world, we would divorce the essential role of journalism, which is to put a check on power, which is to speak truth to power, which is to be a watchdog, which is to keep an eye on powerful people and see what they're doing. We would divorce that completely from financial concerns. We would divorce it from advertising and sponsorships. How would that work? I'm not sure, because if you connect it to the government in some way, like if you had a government-run media, that creates a whole new set of problems. I don't know if you would.
Let me insert my opinion in there. I think that, in Harthagen's perfect world, there would be like federal funding and local control. There would be a per capita amount allocated to Louisville, to maybe metropolitan statistical areas. And I don't know the details, but there would be some way of allocating the funds equitably, and there would be certain standards put in place. But if you could just, think of NPR without commercial sponsorship, Corporation for Public Broadcasting was supposed to be absent of commercial sponsorship, and they turned out to not be that. I just think if democracy is important, then there would be a way of making it so that, government sounds so ominous. It sounds like everything is being centrally controlled, like you have a ministry of truth or a ministry of information. But it just seems like to me that there would be a way of having it democratically controlled at the local level while being funded by the federal government.
I think you're right. I think that's probably the way to do it, but you would want to set it up so that, as you said, you'd want to have local control, but you would also want to get the funding away from the government agencies that are dispersing it, right? You want to set it up in such a way that, first of all, the government can't turn off the funding spigot when they don't like your reporting, but the government can still hold you accountable for things that aren't related to your funding, right? Like, let's say they give $1 million to somebody to start up a local newspaper in a community that needs it, and that person just spends it all on sports cars and houses. We want to cut off that guy's funding, right? But
right.
You've got to set up some sort of barrier, some sort of information barrier, some sort of power barrier, to where the funding is safe no matter what type of journalism is produced.
Right.
And then you have to live with the fact that it will occasionally produce some stuff that's not good journalism. Right. And that's just part of what you get. But that's true under the current system. So that flaw is not a unique flaw. Like, we currently have a lot of bad journalism. So I think that would be an inevitable part of it.
Okay, so let's talk about the, in recent years, since when Chomsky, in manufacturing consent, they talk about the consolidation of media organizations, and it's gone much further since they wrote their book. When they wrote their book, there might have been 50 media organizations that own most of the commercial media in the United States. Now Wikipedia says there are currently 4 media conglomerates that own 90% of the media in the United States. So what's the difference? In the United States, the media has always been commercial, but how is it different when you have these corporations just consolidating everything? Is that against the public interest, for one thing?
Well, I think it is against the public interest because, of course, every company wants to turn a profit. But the number one goal of every single one of these 4 or 5, media corporations that include some news outlets, their goal is profit above all else. I often tell my students, there's sort of like a binary here, elitist and populist. The populists will give you whatever type of information that you want. And if you want, 14 2-hour-long superhero movies, they'll give it to you, right? they didn't make superhero movies over and over again until superhero movies were actually successful. Once they started making millions and millions and millions of dollars, boy, it's just been one superhero movie after another, right? If
But
we
to me,
wanted,
that's I see what you mean by populist, but to me, that's capital flowing toward that. I mean,
no,
because
that's exactly what it is.
it's not just consumer taste. It's also like sponsorship by the Pentagon, and it's also that filter that says if I'm sponsoring a movie or if I'm, it's just going to filter out anything that is against the military industrial complex, anything that is against the interests of the multinational media corporations, including Disney, anything that's against the interests of McDonald's and multinational restaurant corporations. So anyway.
So yeah, well, I mean, these media organizations are, most of them are not just media organizations. Take Disney, for example.
Mm-hmm.
Disney owns ABC, Disney owns Marvel, Disney owns ESPN, Disney owns so many properties.
So let's look at that.
Yeah.
I'm sorry to interrupt. Let's look at that in terms of monopoly. I mean, there was a time, not like the good old days, but if you think that monopolies are bad, look at all of the different types of organizations they're now allowed to own that they used to not be allowed to own. They're allowed to own a TV network. They're allowed to own a sports network. They're allowed to own probably other movie companies. They're probably allowed to own whatever distribution, or probably some retailers, some distribution networks, on and on and on.
Well, and this is where we get into the journalism part of it, right? Like, I would argue that media conglomeration is bad for all media, but it's especially bad for journalism, because what you get is journalistic synergy, right? Like ABC may produce a news story about a new Disney park that has a Star Wars feature, right? How is that news? And you might see, who cares?
Right.
And you might see multiple news organizations all owned by the same company, all producing very similar stories. Well,
right.
Here's the thing: they might be important stories, right? They might be good stories. They might be journalistically valid stories. But because of the synergy, because of the conglomeration, and now instead of getting 8 different news stories, we're now getting one story reported by the same 8 news outlets. That are all owned by one organization.
That has the tendency of eliminating local news. I mean, they only give you as much local news as they have to.
Right.
It's otherwise just this McNews, USA Today type of McNews that they give you as like, they might have the Courier might have a story about Papa John's, but it's the same kind of news gathering process. And that same story might be in the Wall Street Journal. It's just maybe at a different place in the Courier. I'm probably wrong about that part, but anyway, just eliminating local. One effect of the Communications Act of 1996, I've been told, is to eliminate, eliminate local news. So.
Well, yeah, one of the arguments that Newt Gingrich and the other folks made, and that Bill Clinton made when he signed that act into law, was that this would help media, right? They was, the media is struggling, and this will make it easier for, the businesses that run the news organizations to make money and so on and so forth. And they were right. It made it easier for some of them to make money, but of course it led to less news. We see it now with the Gannett Gatehouse merger. Gannett and Gatehouse, the 2 biggest media chains in the newspaper chains in the country, they merge, and then what happens after the merger? Well, the same thing that happens after every corporate merger: layoffs.
Yeah.
And journalism organizations need reporters. You can't just lay your way off to profitability in any business, but you can't especially do it in the news business. You've got to have reporters to cover stories.
So you have to notice here how the interests of capital and the interests of democracy are not always the same, to say the least. Capital wants to make money off of news, but the public has an interest in, lots of good, objective reporting at every level of government, at every community. Capital, if anything, wants to keep you in the dark. and keep you entertained, but not keep you really aware of their power, the power that they have, the power that they have over government, et cetera. But
yeah, we often think of capitalism and democracy as being synonymous, but of course that's not true. There's plenty of capitalist societies that are not democracies. There's plenty of democracies that are not capitalist. And even the ones that are capitalist and democracies are not capitalist democracies in the same way that the United States is. And so, yeah, these are two different systems. One is a political system, and one is an economic system. And by nature, they're going to come into conflict. And I think you're right. That is one major way that they come into conflict, is that we have to have a strong, viable news media in this country, specifically so we can have a strong, viable democracy. But a strong, viable news media is, although capitalists can make money off of it, they certainly do not want the strong, viable news media exposing their labor abuses, their environmental abuses, their tax breaks, their back scratching with politicians, their bribes, their corruption. That's not a good function of journalism from capital's perspective.
so, if James Miller were the king of the United States and you could do anything, what would you change, and how does the media fit into that?
Well, that is a big question. That's a good question for us to end on. I think one thing that I would definitely do, which I think would not be very popular with our overlords and masters in this country, is that I would make a rule that said that companies had to die along with their founders. So if I found a company and that company is wildly successful and I make tens of millions of dollars in profits, I get to keep all that money. Sure, that's fine.
So corporations don't get to live forever. Corporations should not be immortal.
Exactly. Once I die, my corporation is dissolved. The assets are distributed to all the employees, or even like the stockholders of the company, right? My children, my inheritors could have a portion of it too, right? Like the money isn't just like taken by the government, but this entity no longer continues to exist, because I disagree with Mitt Romney. Corporations are not people. And I think so many of the problems in our society can be traced directly to immortal corporations that want to reshape society in their interests and not in the people's interests.
Right. We have about another 6 or 7 minutes. This is Hart Hagen on WFMP Forward Radio. Our show is Truth to Power, and my guest is James Miller. James is a teacher of journalism at DuPont Manual High School here in Louisville, and we're talking about manufacturing consent, which is a theory by Noam Chomsky and Edward Herman in the book by Herman and Chomsky called Manufacturing Consent. And we're here to say that not everything, not only is not everything reported in the media true, but there's a kind of a systematic theory called manufacturing consent, or called the propaganda model, that that shows it to be, exactly how is it distorted and filtered. And one of the propaganda, we haven't talked about the word or the concept of propaganda yet, James, but the thing that, if I had to make a list of what I want every American to know, high on that list would be that we have the most effective propaganda system in the world, and it indoctrinates people. And it, like you said, it's not a conspiracy, it's not centrally controlled, but it does go the way of capital. Capital kind of has a mind of its own and has a way of making sure that, has a way of preserving its own power and money, and whatever it takes to continue to concentrate wealth in the hands of a very, very few, that tends to be what gets reported. And it goes to ideas like American exceptionalism and America, in so many words, being the policeman of the world. It has to do with anti-Arab racism. It has to do with thinking that America is number one and our way is the best way, even when it's not. Like a healthcare system that should be the shame and the embarrassment of the world. So help me out here.
Well, I think what you said about institutions is really important because institutions have their own interests and their own memories and their own goals. Um, it doesn't matter what person you put in the executive chair of a company, that person is going to act according to that institution's interests. That person would not have become the CEO of that company if the people who put that person in that seat did not feel that they were going to work in that institution's interests. But this is not just true of corporations. This is true of religious institutions. This is true of government institutions. This is true of educational institutions, right? And so, again, I want to go back to say, like, you know, when we talk about how we're the most propagandized society, again, there's not like a central office of American propaganda where they ensure that the citizens have the right information, right? In fact, I think a lot of people would hear this and say, what are you guys talking about? We have liberal media, we have centrist media, we have conservative media, right? Like, we have all these different perspectives.
Yeah.
But to those people, I would say the area of disagreement with a lot of those organizations is actually very narrow. Look at what they agree on. Look at the things that you mentioned a second ago, for example, right? The liberal, centrist, and conservative media almost all uniformly agree that we should provide unconditional military aid to Israel, no matter what Israel does to the Palestinian people, right? Almost all of them agree that a lightly regulated capitalism is the best system of the economy for this country. Almost all of them agree that it is unpatriotic to criticize your government during wartime, which I think is part of the reason so many administrations, Democratic and Republican alike, you know, are really prone to use war to solve problems, because they know that America on a war footing is an America where they're criticized less, right?
Yeah.
I mean, that was true. You know, that's Bill Clinton, you know, lobbing cruise missiles during the Monica Lewinsky, you know, trial, right? You know, you can trace it back to just about every president. But yeah, there's institutional interest, and that is what generates the propaganda, because the institution is not going to let you succeed if you do not meet the interest of the institution, right? If you're someone, let's go back to my Starbucks example. If you're someone who hates coffee and thinks caffeine is poison, why would you become the president of Starbucks? Like, why would Starbucks agree to promote you to this point where you can propagate your anti-coffee views? They're not going to. Likewise, a capitalist organization such as a giant news conglomerate is not going to promote somebody who says, hey, maybe we should rethink capitalism, and says it in a way that is both like popular and meaningful and articulate and reverberates with the public in a way, you know, that's not just like some harmless, like Jon Stewart style.
We've got about 30 seconds left. What would you like for people to know about manufacturing consent?
A lot of people ask me, what is the best way to get the news? And the answer is get it from a variety of sources. Mm-hmm. Get it from liberal and left sources. Get it from centrist sources. There's nothing wrong with looking at Fox News occasionally. Get it from a variety of sources, and also look at primary sources. Read what the documents actually say.
James Miller, thank you so much for joining me. We'll have to do it again soon. It's been fun.
Thank you so much, Hart. It's been a pleasure.